This video is meant to be a reference guide for the basics of getting our motion capture animation from Motion Builder to Maya and then doing a rendering in Maya using the Arnold render engine. So I have an animation here in Motion Builder, and this animation is on the control rig. In other words, if I had mixed anything in the story window, I right-clicked on it and baked it or plotted it down to the current take. We can't send story window animations to Maya. It has to be baked onto the control rig or plotted to the control rig. So you see there's nothing here in the story window. The animation resides on the control rig. Now in class we also looked at how we can then bake to the skeleton and then save out an FBX manually, which would allow us to go into the game engines and other 3D applications. But we have a very unique feature here in Motion Builder where we can send it to Maya, which means we don't need to do anything manually. And this only works if our Motion Builder and our Maya versions match. So I'm running Motion Builder 2019 and Maya 2019. So if I go to the File menu, I can choose Send to Maya, Send as New Scene. And then what will happen there is, after I do that, the animation will come over to Maya. So here's my character in Maya. Notice it still has a control rig because Maya does recognize the control rig. So now once I get this animation to Maya, I can start thinking about the rendering process. So again, as we mentioned in class, one of the first things we want to do is deal with shadows. Casting shadows is a very important part of the finishing process or the rendering process. So I'm going to come up here to the Create menu and add a polygon plane, and it's very small on the ground there. So I'm just going to scale it up a lot so that it's large enough to encompass my character's animation. So I'm going to zoom out a little bit here to see where I am. And now it's caught the character, and if I scrub through the animation, see the character stops and turns around right there. So that should work. Actually, I'm going to make it just a little. Actually, I'm not going to make it larger. I'm just going to use the move tool and just move it this way because I'm going to catch the shadows on this plane. So I need to make sure in case the shadow casts back in this direction that the plane still catches it and it doesn't fall off the edge of the plane. So let's see where I am here. Boy, she's right at the edge. The character's right at the edge and at the beginning and the end of the animation. So I'm just going to do a little more scaling that way just to make sure I have enough area to catch the shadows. So I do. Okay, so now what we can do is we can start thinking about setting up our lights for rendering. So if I render right now, which I could do with the IPR right here, it's the interactive preview renderer, and Arnold should be our default render engine in the later versions of Maya, I think 2018 and above, and I can check that from this button right here. It looks like a scene clapper with a gear. If I click on that, oh, and this panel is really tall, so let me just bring it in line with my recording. So you can see right there it's using Arnold. So if I hit the IPR, which is now off on my other screen, let me bring that into view also here, it's completely dark. Because the way Arnold works is that if there are no lights in the scene, it will render completely dark. So I need to add a light. Now, we could study lighting for an entire semester, which we do in some courses. So in terms of lighting, I have a lot of options here. Now I can use from the Create menu the lights listed here. Now disregard these lights. These are RenderMan lights because I have RenderMan installed. If you don't have RenderMan installed, you probably just see these lights here. Now I also have Redshift, so they're listed here. The basic lights that you will probably see are right here, from ambient light down to volume light. And we can use these with Arnold. Arnold will recognize these default Maya lights, but I like to use the actual Arnold lights. Now the Arnold lights can be found up here along the top. There is a menu which is getting cut off here because I've squeezed my interface into my recording area, so I have a little expansion button here, and you'll probably see an Arnold menu item up here. So it would be right there, Arnold, and then there's lights, and these lights are off screen, but actually I can tear them off and bring them on. Whoops, lights. There we go. So there's the Arnold lights. And you can see their names are very similar to what we have with the Maya lights. The recommendation is to use the Arnold lights if you're rendering with Arnold, because they just happen to be a little more optimized than using the Maya lights. But again, Arnold will recognize the Maya lights. The other big difference here is that the Arnold lights are physically accurate. So they'll have proper fall off. So it just means that they'll be more realistic. So again, I would recommend using the Arnold lights. Now, for what we're doing in class, just to do a quick rendering or finishing of our motion capture animations, I would recommend using the area light. Actually, the main combination we would use here is the area light and the sky dome, these two together. So I'm going to go ahead and put an area light in the scene. So it's right here. And I can scale it up so that I can see it. And then I'll move it up a little bit. And we can see it's just a square area. And there's a little arrow there pointing in the direction that it's illuminating. So I can move this light over towards my character, maybe lift it up a little higher and rotate it down a little bit. Oops. Let me just get this, zoom out a little bit and get this lined up. All right, so there's my light. So now that I have a light in the scene, hopefully it will start to render something. So I'm going to put this menu, so actually I'll take this menu and remove it for right now. So if I open up the IPR again, I'm not really seeing anything. And because those lights are physically accurate, what you're going to have to do is increase their intensity quite a bit. So right now my intensity is set to 1. When I say quite a bit, I mean like in orders of hundreds or thousands. So if I try just 100, for instance, you see I still have no light in the scene. If I bring it up to 1000, you can see there's just a little bit starting to show up there. And then we also have exposure, which is just a multiplier on intensity. So if I set my exposure to 2, that's actually an intensity of 2000. So I've just doubled the light. And now I can see that it's starting to illuminate, but I'm essentially at an intensity of 2000 and I'm just barely illuminating the character. So I'll bring my exposure up to 4. And now we can start to see my character. I'll even go up, I'll really go up a lot here, like 8. And now I'm blowing the scene out. But you can see there's a really nice shadow here, which is being cast onto the ground plane. And then I can see my character. Now, the next thing we need to deal with is our character looks like it's made out of chrome. And let me just zoom in on that character a little more so we can see that better. So the interactive preview render will also update if the window's open as I make changes in here. So it's a really nice visualization tool. Yeah, so my character looks like the T-1000 from Terminator. It's all metallic looking. And this is something that we can solve pretty simply also. What's happening here is that the shader that's applied to the character is being interpreted with 100% reflectivity with the Arnold render engine. So what I can do, I'm trying to move this around and not get it to dock anywhere, and that can be a challenge. It wants to dock it in a window. Oh boy, so let me move it over here, like this. So if I select part of my character's body, I can then come over here to my attribute editor. Let's see if I can shrink this down so it's more manageable. There, that's better. And in the attribute editor, with that body part selected, I can scroll all the way to the end, and I'll have probably some really long esoteric name here. This is because of sending this from Motion Builder, but that is the material. So if I select it, and I scroll down through the material, actually the first thing we'll notice is that it comes in with some ambient color, and that's not good. This is going to add basically indirect light, and it really tends to flatten the character's shading out. So we want to have no ambient color there. So I'm pulling that out. That's step 1. And then the next step is to come down here to the specular shading, and right there it says reflectivity 1. That means it's 100% reflective, like chrome. So I'm going to drop the reflectivity all the way out, and then we can see the material and the texture that's applied to it. Actually, the texture, I guess, is more importantly what I'm saying. Now, this material has been applied to the entire body except the head. So you see it also took care of the hair and some of the other body parts. So now I just need to do the head. So I'll come over here in the viewport and I just hit Q so that I can get to my selection tool. And I have the head selected. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Over here we see right at the top it has ambient color. So I'm going to drop that out. And then I'm going to scroll down to the specular shading and drop the reflectivity all the way down. And now my character looks more appropriate. Now this is actually a standard, I believe it might be a Phong material. Yep, right there it is in Maya. We did not cover using Arnold shaders, except we're going to use one Arnold shader here to capture the shadow on the ground. But Arnold has a whole bunch of shaders, which again we could spend a whole semester studying. So just to get us through our final rendering for class, these are the steps we want to do. Just lower the ambient and remove the reflectivity, and then your character should render appropriately in Arnold inside Maya. So now this looks a little more appropriate. Now what I could do is if I want to add some actual indirect light to the scene. Now Arnold is a physically accurate render engine from the start. We don't need to enable global illumination. It is actually bouncing light in the scene right away, which a lot of render engines don't. They will require us to activate global illumination. So Arnold is doing it by default, but sometimes the scene just gets a little dark. So actually before I do that, I want to just address one of the primary optimization techniques in Arnold, which is grain in the shadow areas. You can see this shadow is quite grainy. Now our inclination with a render engine is to go to the render engine settings. So if I go back to the scene clapper with the gear, boy, this keeps resetting itself. All right, there we go. Is to go to the Arnold tab, and in the Arnold tab, we start cranking up our sampling here. And that will help, but it's not really the most optimized way to deal with this grain or noise that we get in the shadow. Arnold has a sampling attribute for each light source, and that's what we want to use to try to get rid of this grain or noise before we start cranking up global samples in here. So I'm going to put this aside, and in the scene I'm going to grab my light. So can I get my light in the scene? Well, yeah, I can move it here a little bit. Or actually, why don't I just use the outliner instead? So in the outliner, there's my area light. So now my area light's attributes will show up over here in the attribute editor. And if I scroll down through these, there it is, samples right there. So let me increase that. It's at 1. My recommendation is to go up by small increments. So I could go to 2. And it's still a little grainy, so I'll do 3. Because the more samples we add, the longer the render times are going to take. And you see that knocked out quite a bit of the noise. I'll do one more though, 4. So my render time was 2 seconds. So that's pretty acceptable. But you'll notice that all the grain is gone. So that's one of the quickest ways to get your rendering looking a little bit nicer, remove the noise and the shadows without increasing your overall samples in here, is to address it on the light source by itself first. So now at this point I can start to become creative with my lighting, add more light, maybe more area lights to paint more light into the scene, or if I want to just add some overall ambient or indirect light, I could add another light type from Arnold called the Sky Dome. So I'm going to do that. So I'll come up to my Arnold menu again. So I'll go Arnold, Lights, and this time I'm going to use the Sky Dome light. So I'll add that to the scene. And now that really adds a lot of light. But you see it creates this very large dome in the background. And now what I could do is with that light selected, I could come over here to its attributes and I could bring its intensity down. If I wanted to just spill a small amount of indirect light in the scene, I can maybe make it something like 0.1. So now you see I'm getting some indirect light in the scene. Now this light source also has a sample, It is casting shadows, but because it's such a huge light, its shadow is so diffuse and soft you can't really see it. But if you find that you can see its shadow and it's noisy, you want to do the same thing here, increase its sampling rate. So this is the really basic setup. Now the problem with this is I do not like seeing the edge of my ground plane because I think that distracts from the composition. So what we can do is add a matte shadow. Well, depending on the render engine you use, it comes in all kinds of names. It's called a holdout, a matte shadow, shadow catcher. In Arnold, it's called a shadow matte, I believe. We'll see in a minute. So what that's going to do is that's a very special Arnold material that tells whatever surface it's applied to, in this case the ground plane, the plane here, it tells it to cast shadows but don't do anything else. So it will actually become transparent everywhere there's not a shadow being cast onto it. So that's why sometimes we call it a shadow catcher, because it catches the shadows and nothing else. So it's pretty easy to apply. What we do is we need to select the ground plane, which I've done here, and then I'm going to right click on it. And again, the techniques and steps I'm showing you here are just the quickest way to do this, since this is not a Maya or a rendering class. There are many other ways of working. Usually when you're working with materials, we use the hypershade, but in this case I'm trying to do everything just in the viewport. So I'm going to right click on the ground plane, and this is being cut off in the video, but down off screen is an option that says assign new material. So I'm going to click on that, and that will open up the assign new material window. And under the Arnold shaders here, Arnold shader, we have a special material called the shadow matte. I tried to combine both words together. Shadow matte. So I'm going to select that. And now magically we get this really nice rendering. We don't see the edges of our ground plane. We're just seeing the shadow being cast. And that looks so much better than having those distracting edges from my ground plane. So that's the really basic setup. There is a key light, which is our rectangular light, and then the sky dome. Now the other thing that we looked at in class is applying an HDR image to the sky dome, which is typically used as a way to basically take a photograph maybe that was done on set in live action, and then we can take that environment and basically project it all over our sky dome and use that to illuminate the scene, which then basically means our CG character's lighting will match the lighting that was on set. And you may have seen this in the making of movies where they're running around with a chrome ball. That's getting lighting references. So that's called an HDR, high dynamic range image. So I'm going to use that to light the scene. So I'm going to just close my render view for a moment here, the IPR. I'm also going to close my outliner. And I'm going to remove the key light here, the area light, because I'm not going to use that as my primary light source. So I'll just remove that. So now all I have in here is the sky dome, which without a key light, the sky dome is going to look really flat. You can see like I have here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply an HDR image. You can find these on the internet for free in many cases. You just do a search for .hdr. So I'm going to select the sky dome. And then over here in the sky dome settings, right at the top, we usually apply the HDR image to the color attribute of the sky dome. So I'm going to hit the little checker box to apply a texture. So I'll click on that, and the window comes up and it says, what do you want to create or attach here? And I'm going to do a file. That'll allow me to bring in a texture file. So I'll choose file, and then it attaches the file, but it still needs me to go find the image. So I'm going to click on the little browse button here. And on my desktop I have, let's see, which one do I want to use? I have a couple of these here. So they're .hdr format. So let's see, I have port, I have a probe. Oh, no, there it is right there. And then I have the same which two am I using here? I've got that one or the port. Now these are in different formats. The square format is what's called lat-long, latitude, longitude, and then this one is spherical or angular. So whichever one you find, you're going to have to tell the sky dome what orientation it's using. I'm going to go ahead and use this one. So this is the angular configuration. So I'll hit open. And you can see it comes in, and I can actually see it on the sky dome, and it doesn't look like it's lined up properly. And that's because the sky dome by default is oriented under format here to lat-long. Now I'm going to change that to angular. And then it should, although there's, right here is where the stitch is. So I can see that, but if I turn it around, you can see that it actually, for the most part, shows me the HDR texture without any distortion. So now what I could do is if I want to line my character up here and I see that seam behind them, I could take my sky dome and then just simply rotate it with the rotate tool. I'll have to zoom out a little bit so I can see the rotate tool, and I could just rotate it around like this. There we go. Let's do that. Then I'll zoom back in on my character. That's a little bit better. And now if I do a IPR render, let's see what we get. So now the character is being completely illuminated by that HDR image in my sky dome. Now it's pretty dark, so what I can do is come over here and increase its intensity. Because my intensity was set to 0.1 from when I did the first lighting configuration example. So I'll set it back up to 1. And now I have a more appropriately lit situation. So you can see now how the character really feels like they fit the environment because they're being illuminated by the texture map itself that's on the sky dome. And it's because it's a huge sky dome or a huge light source. We can see that the shadow being cast is really faint, but it is noisy, it's grainy. So I'm going to want to come in here and bring my samples up. Let's try 4. And that gets rid of the grain. So now it's nice and smooth. Now, if I want, I could add an area light if I wanted to get a little more definitive shadowing in here. I could add that and then mix the two light sources together. So this is the other lighting configuration that we talked about in class. Now, what's interesting about this is that we have some creative controls with it. So for instance, if I wanted this sky dome to illuminate the character, but I didn't want to actually see this image in the background, because sometimes it's nice to use an HDR image to get some nice varied lighting on the character, as opposed to the sky dome by itself with no HDR is very uniform and almost flattens the rendering. What I can do is I can tell Arnold to use this sky dome to illuminate the character but not show it in the background. And I can do that again within the sky dome's attribute editor here. If I scroll down towards the bottom, right here it is under visibility, we have a lot of different options, and the first one here is camera. So right now it's 100% visible to the camera, and I don't want that. I'm going to set that to 0. So now you see I actually get the lighting from the sky dome and the HDR image on the character, but I have a completely dark background. So that may or may not be what you want if you're going to use an HDR image, but I just wanted to point that out. That's a very flexible attribute option that we have with the sky dome. Now the problem here is that because I was using a matte shadow, or the shadow matte on the ground, and my background is black, I don't even have any shadowing. So in this case, I probably want to keep my camera at 1, allow Maya to use, or Arnold to use that as a background, and it also gives me some shadowing. So that's our basic lighting configuration, and now we're really ready to go into the rendering process. So the other thing that we want to consider here is our camera composition. So let me just close this for a minute. And by default, I'm in the perspective view. And if I rendered right now, I would be rendering from the perspective view. I could see that in my render settings here. So there's the Arnold settings, but when it comes to camera control and resolution of our rendering, that's all done in the Common tab. So in the Common tab, here's where I can choose, and I'll just cover this now since I have it open. In the Render Settings Common tab, this is where I can choose my file format. By default, it does EXR, which is great if you're doing work for film. But for our class, we don't need an EXR. That's going to just be a huge file with lots of frame buffers that we don't need. So I'm going to change that to JPEG because I don't need transparency or anything. So I'll change the type to JPEG, and then I need to tell it that I want to render an animation, and by default it's set to single frame. So if I click on that drop box, the one that I like to use is name.number.extension. That means the name of the file, and then the frame number, and then the extension, which is JPEG. And that's a common configuration that something like DaVinci Resolve or Premiere can recognize. And then I'm going to scroll down here and tell it what frame range to render. So I'm going to go from frame 0 to however long my animation is, let's say 120 frames or something like that. And then right below it is where I was getting to previously, which is where we're rendering from. Since there are no other cameras in the scene, it defaults to the perspective camera. And I'll change that in just a minute. And then right below that, very important thing, is our image size. So this is where we want to determine our render resolution. So I believe I said in class that I want you to render full HD, which is 1080. Or if your render times are too long, you can drop it to 720. I'll choose 1080. So you see this gives me 1920 by 1080, typical HD format. So I should be good in here other than selecting the camera, which I have to create a camera first. So I'm going to put this aside, and I'm going to create a camera. So I'll go to the Create menu and do Cameras, and I'll just add a standard camera here. So it adds the camera to the scene, and if I want to view through that camera, I can do that from the Panels menu. I can go to Perspective, and there it is. It's called Camera 1. So I'll select that. So now I'm viewing through the camera. So now if I navigate in Maya, I'm actually navigating or moving that camera around. So I'll put it maybe right here, so you can see where my character is actually moving away from me. Now, one thing I'm missing though is I don't know exactly what's in frame and out of frame because I can't trust that my viewport is in the aspect ratio of my resolution, which is 16 by 9, 1920 by 1080. So once you create a camera and you set your resolution here in the render settings, right here, then what we can do is go to the View menu for our viewport, go to Camera Settings, and choose Resolution Gate. Now that's showing me exactly what's in frame. And if I run through my animation, my character is going to go by the camera. And in this case, what I could do is I could animate my camera to pan or track with the character. And animating a camera in Maya is just like animating any other object. So if I'm working with the camera, I can just come over here to the channel box and I can key the translates and rotates, which can be done by just right-clicking on it and choosing Key Selected. So I've just keyed it in frame 0, and then I could come out here, and when the character runs by me, I can just move my camera out and reframe the character, maybe like this, and then I'll rekey these in frame 60. So now what we have is we have a camera that's tracking with our character. Oops, I didn't go far enough, but you get the idea because this video is getting very long. I'm at a half an hour already. So that's how we can do some nice creative camera composition as we're building our renders in Maya. Now, the last thing we need to be concerned with is the actual rendering process. So if I bring my render settings back into view here, I want to make sure I'm rendering from the right camera. So again, I'm in the Common tab. And if I scroll down, no, up it's right here. It's still defaulting to the perspective camera, so I'm going to hit that drop box and say, nope, I want to render from camera 1 instead. So just to review what I did in here, I chose the image format. I chose my animation extension, which is name.number.extension. I chose my frame range to render, my camera, and the render resolution. And that should be all I need to do in here. And in the Arnold render tab, we shouldn't have to change anything in here either. Again, the main optimization tool is just simply increasing the samples on each light, and that should be good enough for what we're doing in class. And now I'm ready to render. So I'm going to close my render settings. Now, when you're rendering with Arnold, we need to not do a batch render. So if I come over here to the rendering menu set, and I go to the render menu, we can batch render. But a batch render is going to give you renders with an Arnold watermark. What we need to do is do render sequence. And we shouldn't have to change anything in the options in here. We just simply render the sequence. Now, one thing we have to be careful of, though, is where it's going to render this sequence of JPEG images. If I go back to my render settings, right here at the top, it tells me where it's going. It's going to the default Maya projects folder. So this is why it's important, which I didn't do in this video, is to set up your project window or set your project to a particular folder in Maya. Then that will tell us that will give us control over where this goes. You don't want it to go here. You want it to go to your own project folder. So again, we do that by File. Project Window will allow me to create a new project, or Set Project will allow me to take my current Maya file and set it to a specific location. So that's what you'll have to do before you render. Otherwise, you're going to have to go to the whatever computer you're on. You have to go to Documents, Maya, Projects, Default Images to find your sequence. So once you change that, then we can go to the render menu and just choose render sequence, and it will render out all of our JPEGs. Then we can take those into DaVinci Resolve or Premiere or whatever image or video editor you're using, and then re-render our digital movie, our MOV. So that's what we covered in class. These are the basic steps that we covered in class. So I hope that helps with your final renders for the end of the semester.